The morning of September 14th, 1944, brought unseasonably cold rain to the forests east of Nancy, France. Staff Sergeant Robert Earley sat motionless in the commander's position of his M10 tank destroyer, watching water stream off the 3-inch gun barrel pointing toward a narrow farm road 1,200 yards distant. His crew had been in this position for 6 hours, hull down behind a collapsed stone wall, with only the gun and upper turret visible above the ridgeline. The engine was cold. They'd shut it down 90 minutes ago to eliminate any sound or exhaust signature that might give away their position. In the tree line across the valley, Earley could see movement through his binoculars. German infantry, maybe a full company, moving west in loose formation. Behind them, somewhere beyond the visual range of naked eyes, came the reason his battalion commander had ordered this particular section of tank destroyers to this particular hillside and told them not to move until they saw what they were waiting for. Then Earley heard it. Not saw it, heard it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. That low mechanical growl that carried across damp air like distant thunder. The distinctive engine note of a Maybach HL-230, the power plant that drove Germany's most feared armoured vehicles. He raised his fist without taking his eyes from the binoculars. Behind him, his gunner, Corporal James McCoy, traversed the turret with microscopic precision, watching his own telescopic sight for the target that Earley's experience told him was about to appear. 60 seconds passed. The infantry column had moved into a draw and disappeared from view. The road remained empty except for rain and shadows. Then the forest seemed to birth a monster, low, wide, angular. A Panzer VI Tiger emerging from the tree line at walking pace, its 88mm gun sweeping slowly from side to side as the commander scanned for threats. Behind it, another Tiger, then a third. Earley's hand signals were economical, precise, range, 1200, lead target, wait for flank. His gunner acknowledged with a single nod, traverse stopped, sight picture locked. The Tigers were moving in column formation on a road that would bring them parallel to the American position at optimal engagement angle. Everything about this moment had been planned 6 months ago by men who'd never seen this hillside but understood the mathematics of ambush warfare with mathematical precision. The first Tiger was 200 yards from the kill zone when its commander apparently decided the road was secure. The massive tank accelerated slightly, tracks churning mud, presenting its side armour to Earley's position for the first time. McCoy's voice came through the intercom, flat and professional, masking the adrenaline. Identified. Tiger. 1,200 yards. Side shot. Ready. Earley let the Tiger advance another 20 yards. At 1,200 yards, even the M10's 3-inch gun was marginal against Tiger armour. But they weren't aiming at the thickest parts. They were aiming at engineering compromises. The side hull where ammunition was stored, the turret ring where armour transitioned from vertical to horizontal planes, the specific weak points that American intelligence had been documenting since Tigers first appeared in Tunisia 20 months earlier. Fire! The 3-inch gun roared, the entire vehicle rocking backward on its suspension despite the bulk of 17 tons trying to absorb the recoil. Through his binoculars, Earley watched the tracer arc across the valley in a flat trajectory that dropped only 16 feet at that range. The armour-piercing round struck the Tiger's side hull 3 feet behind the forward drive sprocket, exactly where McCoy had aimed. Sparks showered off the German tank's flank. For a half second, nothing happened. Then orange flame vomited from every hatch as ammunition cooked off inside the Tiger's fighting compartment. The turret didn't blow off, like in the movies. It simply became a furnace with the crew trapped inside. The second Tiger was already traversing toward the muzzle flash on the hillside when McCoy fired again. 7 seconds between shots, a rate of fire that Sherman crews couldn't match with their larger guns. The second round caught the Tiger's turret face at an angle, ricocheting upward but transferring enough kinetic energy to jam the turret traverse. The German tank was still combat capable, still dangerous, but it was also immobilized by a jammed turret and facing the wrong direction to return fire. The 3rd Tiger did what Tiger commanders were trained to do. It accelerated hard, attempting to close distance and get out of the kill zone. But Early had positioned his section with overlapping fields of fire. A 2nd M10, commanded by Sergeant Donald Webb and positioned 400 yards south of Early's location, had been waiting for exactly this reaction. Webb's gunner fired as the Tiger presented its rear armor during the turn. The shot entered the engine compartment, and the Maybach that had sounded so threatening 90 seconds ago seized with a grinding scream of tortured metal. 3 Tigers disabled in less than 30 seconds, total rounds expended. 4. American casualties. 0. The surviving German infantry that had been accompanying the armor column were now scattering into the forest, abandoning vehicles they couldn't defend against an enemy they couldn't see. This was the end result of a doctrinal revolution that had begun in the spring of 1943, when American planners finally accepted a truth that ground commanders had been reporting for months. You couldn't beat German armor by fighting it the way Germans fought armor. The tank destroyer force that landed in North Africa in November 1942 had been conceived with a specific mission: aggressive pursuit of enemy armor, using speed and firepower to offset defensive vulnerabilities. The doctrine was called Seek, Strike, Destroy, and it envisioned tank destroyer battalions racing forward to intercept German panzer thrusts, meeting them head-on in mobile engagements where American superior numbers and mechanical reliability would prevail. The reality of combat against German armor shattered those assumptions within weeks. At Kasserine Pass, in February 1943, American tank destroyer battalions, equipped with M3 and M10 vehicles, attempted to execute the aggressive pursuit doctrine against attacking German Panzer and Panzergrenadier formations. The results were catastrophic. German 88mm guns engaged American tank destroyers at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards, distances where American 3-inch and 37mm guns were marginal at best. American crews found themselves taking fire from enemy positions they couldn't see, couldn't range accurately, and couldn't penetrate even when they scored hits. The mobility that was supposed to be the tank destroyer's primary advantage became irrelevant when German guns could kill them before they closed to effective range. Casualty rates among tank destroyer battalions in those first engagements exceeded 40% in some units. The M10 3-inch gun motor carriage, which would eventually become the workhorse of American tank destroyer battalions, exemplified both the promise and the problems of American anti-armor doctrine. The vehicle mounted a 3-inch M7 gun capable of penetrating approximately 3 inches of armor at 1,000 yards when firing standard armor-piercing ammunition. That penetration was theoretically sufficient against most German armor. A Panzer IV's side armor was only 30mm, less than 1.5 inches. A Panther's side hull was 40mm. Even the dreaded Tiger had side armor of 80mm, just over 3 inches. On paper, the M10 could kill anything in the German infantry if it could achieve flank shots at reasonable ranges. The problem was that German doctrine didn't offer flank shots. German tanks operated with infantry support, with overlapping fields of fire, with reconnaissance elements that identified threats before the main armor made contact. German tank commanders had been fighting armor warfare since 1939 and had developed tactical sophistication that American crews, many of whom had been civilians 18 months earlier, couldn't match through aggression alone, and German guns simply outranged American weapons by margins that made mobility irrelevant. An 88 could reliably penetrate an M10's frontal armor at 2,000 yards. The M10 needed to close to under 800 yards to have reasonable penetration probability against Tiger front armor. Those numbers represented a death sentence for any tank destroyer attempting aggressive pursuit. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis, commanding the 632nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, wrote a brutally honest after-action report following operations near El Guetar in March 1943. His unit had lost 18 M10s in 5 days attempting to execute the Seek, Strike, Destroy doctrine as written. "The enemy will not accommodate our tactical preferences," Davis wrote. "German armor operates with combined arms coordination that our doctrine does not account for. Our attempts to aggressively pursue and engage enemy tanks have resulted in our vehicles being engaged at ranges where we cannot effectively return fire. We are losing 3 tank destroyers for every enemy vehicle we destroy. This is unsustainable. Davis's report landed on the desk of Major General Andrew Bruce, commanding general of the Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, Texas. Bruce had been one of the architects of the original tank destroyer doctrine, and the failure of that doctrine in combat represented both a professional crisis and an opportunity. He could defend the doctrine and blame execution, a path that would preserve his reputation but continue getting men killed, or he could admit the doctrine was flawed and rebuild it from the ground up. Bruce chose the latter. In April 1943, he convened what would later be called the Tank Destroyer Board Review, bringing together combat veterans from North Africa, engineering officers from Aberdeen Proving Ground, and intelligence analysts who'd been studying German armor tactics. The sessions were classified, held in a converted warehouse at Camp Hood, and the participants were told that everything they'd been taught about tank destroyer employment was now open to challenge. The first breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Captain Robert Wilson, an intelligence officer who'd spent 6 months analyzing German tank radio intercepts and tactical reports, presented data that contradicted fundamental assumptions about how German armor operated. "We've been assuming German tanks are aggressive, mobile hunters," Wilson told the assembled officers. "The intercepts show something different. German armor is doctrinally cautious." Wilson explained that German tank commanders, even in offensive operations, advanced with careful reconnaissance, never exposed their vehicles without infantry support, and withdrew immediately when faced with anti-tank fire they couldn't suppress. "They're not hunting for fights," Wilson said. "They're hunting for advantageous positions. If we try to hunt them the same way, we're playing into their strengths. They have better optics, longer-range guns, and more combat experience. We'll lose that game." The alternative Wilson proposed seemed counterintuitive to doctrine that had emphasized mobility and aggression. Instead of pursuing German armor, tank destroyer battalions should allow German armor to come to them. Instead of fighting mobile engagements in open terrain, they should prepare defensive positions in concealed locations. Instead of seeking combat, they should create conditions where German tanks would unknowingly drive into pre-ranged kill zones. This wasn't defensive warfare in the traditional sense. It was ambush warfare, predatory and patient, that required completely different tactical skills and completely different positioning. Lieutenant Colonel James Edmonds, who'd commanded a tank destroyer battalion at Kasserine and lost 30% of his vehicles in 3 days, was initially skeptical. "You're describing passive defense," Edmonds said. "That's not what tank destroyers were designed for." "No," Wilson replied. "I'm describing ambush. Passive defense waits for the enemy to attack a known position. Ambush creates the illusion of absence, then strikes when the enemy is most vulnerable. German armor won't engage prepared positions with infantry and artillery support, but they will advance through terrain they believe is undefended. That's when we kill them." The distinction seemed subtle, but the tactical implications were profound. Ambush warfare required tank destroyer crews to think like snipers, not cavalrymen. It meant choosing positions based on fields of fire and concealment rather than mobility. It meant accepting that some German attacks might succeed while waiting for the perfect engagement conditions that would allow devastating counterattacks. Most importantly, it meant abandoning the psychological satisfaction of aggressive action in favor of the cold mathematics of favorable kill ratios. General Bruce listened to 3 days of testimony from combat veterans, all of whom confirmed that attempting to fight German armor on German terms was getting Americans killed at unsustainable rates. On April 23, 1943, he issued a directive that would fundamentally reshape how American tank destroyers fought for the rest of the war. Tank destroyer battalions will prioritize positional advantage over mobility. Units will identify and prepare ambush positions along likely enemy armor routes of advance. Engagement will occur at maximum effective range from concealed positions. After engagement, units will displace only if their position is compromised. The goal is not to pursue enemy armor, but to destroy it when it advances into pre-ranged fields of fire. The new doctrine required new training, new tactics, and new ways of thinking about what made a position advantageous. At Camp Hood, the training curriculum was rebuilt around what instructors started calling the ambush box. Instead of teaching crews to maneuver aggressively in open terrain, they learned to identify positions that offered three critical elements: long-range fields of fire, natural concealment, and covered withdrawal routes. Tank destroyer crews practiced range estimation using surveying equipment, creating range cards that marked exact distances to specific terrain features. They learned to use dead ground, terrain folds that concealed their vehicles from enemy observation. They studied forestry maps to identify tree lines that would hide their silhouettes while allowing clear fields of fire. They practiced remaining in position for hours without moving, learning the patience that ambush warfare demanded. The technical capabilities of the M10 suddenly made more sense in this context. The open-top turret that made the vehicle vulnerable to artillery in mobile warfare was less problematic in concealed positions, where counter-battery fire couldn't target what couldn't be seen. The 3-inch gun that was marginal at 800 yards became lethal at 1,200 yards when firing at stationary or slowly moving targets from prepared positions. The vehicle's relatively light weight, which made it vulnerable in direct engagement, allowed it to access positions that heavier tanks couldn't reach, hilltops and ridgelines that offered commanding fields of fire. By summer 1943, newly trained tank destroyer battalions were arriving in Italy, with completely different tactical expectations than their predecessors in North Africa. They were taught to think in terms of engagement zones rather than pursuit routes. They practiced setting up positions before enemy contact, not reacting to enemy movement. They learned to coordinate with infantry and artillery to create killing grounds where German armor would be forced into predetermined fields of fire. The 634th Tank Destroyer Battalion, arriving in Italy in September 1943, put the new doctrine into practice during operations near Salerno. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Wheeler, deployed his M10S in concealed positions overlooking the main coastal highway, the most likely route for German armor counterattacking the beachhead. For 2 days, Wheeler's crews waited while German infantry probed the American positions. The tank destroyers remained silent, commanders resisting the temptation to engage targets they could have easily destroyed. Wheeler was waiting for armor. On September 14th, German reconnaissance elements moved up the highway, half-tracks and armored cars testing for American strength. Wheeler's crews watched them pass, positions still uncompromised. 6 hours later, the reconnaissance was followed by the main attack, 12 Panzer IV tanks and 8 Sturmgeschütz assault guns advancing in column formation up the highway. Wheeler had positioned his tank destroyers in a textbook ambush box, 4 M10S on the high ground east of the highway, with overlapping fields of fire covering a 2,000-yard stretch of road. 2 more M10S positioned further south to engage any vehicles that attempted to reverse out of the kill zone. Infantry observers with radios positioned to provide early warning and adjust fire. When the German column entered the kill zone, the lead Panzer IV was at 1,100 yards from the nearest M10. Wheeler's fire command was 2 words: commence firing. 6 M10S opened fire simultaneously. At 1,100 yards, against the side armor of Panzer IVs, the 3-inch guns were devastating. The first volley destroyed 4 German tanks and disabled 2 more. The German column attempted to reverse, but the M10s positioned to block withdrawal engaged the rear vehicles, trapping the entire formation in the kill zone. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. When it ended, 11 German tanks and all 8 assault guns were destroyed or disabled. American casualties: 2 wounded from German artillery fire that arrived too late to affect the outcome. The 634th had achieved an 11-0 kill ratio using tactics that would have been considered cowardly under the old doctrine. The new doctrine called it effective. Similar engagements across Italy in late 1943 and early 1944 demonstrated that American tank destroyer battalions could achieve devastating effectiveness when they controlled the terms of engagement. The kill ratios spoke for themselves. Tank destroyer battalions using ambush tactics were destroying German armor at ratios between 5-1 and 10-1, compared to the 1-3 ratios that had characterized North African operations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the tactical effectiveness came with psychological costs that training hadn't prepared crews for. Ambush warfare required patience that went against every aggressive instinct American soldiers had been taught. Watching German infantry move through your engagement zone without firing took discipline that felt like cowardice. Waiting hours in concealed positions while combat raged elsewhere created a sense of detachment from the battle, and there was the moral dimension that no training manual addressed. In mobile warfare, when tank crews engaged each other at medium ranges with both sides maneuvering, combat felt like a contest of skill where both participants had agency. In ambush warfare, when American crews fired at German tanks from concealed positions at ranges where return fire was impossible, it felt less like combat and more like murder. Staff Sergeant Robert Earley, whose September engagement near Nancy had destroyed 3 Tigers, wrote about this psychological disconnect in a letter home that his family donated to the National Archives decades later. "We don't fight like soldiers are supposed to fight," Earley wrote. "We hide and wait and shoot men who don't know we're there. I know it's effective. I know it saves American lives. But it doesn't feel like fighting. It feels like something else." The something else Earley struggled to articulate was the psychological space between combat and assassination. In traditional warfare, both sides knew they were in a fight and had opportunities to demonstrate courage, skill, or tactical brilliance. In ambush warfare, one side had all the advantages and the other side died without ever seeing their killers. American crews understood intellectually that German forces would do the same to them, given the opportunity. They understood that war wasn't about fairness but about winning, but understanding didn't eliminate the psychological weight of killing men who never had a chance to fight back. The army didn't have good answers for these concerns. Combat psychiatrists attached to tank destroyer battalions noted increased rates of what they called detachment reactions among crews using ambush tactics, a form of psychological distancing, where soldiers described their combat actions in mechanical terms, devoid of emotional content. "We put rounds on target" replaced "we killed enemy tanks." Engagement successful replaced acknowledgement that human beings had just burned to death inside vehicles they'd ambushed. The clinical language was a psychological defense mechanism, creating mental distance from the moral implications of their effectiveness. But the tactical effectiveness was undeniable, and by early 1944, ambush warfare had become standard doctrine for American tank destroyer battalions. The positioning principles that had been controversial in 1943 were now taught as fundamental tactics: range 1,200 yards, concealed positions with clear fields of fire, overlapping coverage from multiple vehicles. Pre-registered engagement zones, fire discipline that allowed German forces to enter the kill zone before revealing American positions. Immediate displacement after engagement, only if position was compromised. The M10 3-inch gun motor carriage reached peak effectiveness in this role. Its gun could penetrate side armor of any German tank at 1,200 yards. Its relatively low profile allowed it to achieve hull-down positions that concealed everything except the gun and upper turret. Its open-top turret, while still vulnerable, was less problematic in prepared positions than in mobile warfare. And American industrial capacity meant that even when M10s were lost, they could be replaced at rates German forces couldn't match. The arrival of heavier German armor in late 1943 complicated, but didn't fundamentally change the ambush doctrine. Tigers and Panthers had frontal armor that the 3-inch gun couldn't reliably penetrate even at point-blank range, but both vehicles had side and rear armor that remained vulnerable at 1,200 yards. The key was positioning tank destroyers where they could achieve flank shots, which the ambush doctrine specifically enabled. Intelligence analysis of Tiger and Panther employment showed that German commanders used these vehicles as breakthrough assets, concentrating them for offensive operations rather than distributing them widely for defensive operations. This meant that American forces could predict where heavy German armor was likely to appear and position tank destroyers accordingly. When Tigers or Panthers did appear, they typically moved in column formation on roads, exactly the situation where ambush tactics were most effective. The M36 tank destroyer, which began reaching frontline units in fall 1944, brought a more powerful 90mm gun that could penetrate Tiger front armor at 1,000 yards and Panther front armor at 800 yards. But even with this improved firepower, doctrine emphasized ambush over pursuit. The 90mm gun's greater penetration meant that M36 crews could achieve kills from even longer ranges, extending the engagement distance to 1,500 yards in optimal conditions. Statistical analysis of tank destroyer effectiveness in the European theatre from June 1944 through May 1945 shows the impact of ambush doctrine. American tank destroyer battalions destroyed or disabled approximately 3,700 German armored vehicles. American tank destroyer losses totaled approximately 400 vehicles. The kill ratio of approximately 9-1 represented one of the most successful anti-armor campaigns in military history. Breaking down these statistics by engagement type reveals the effectiveness of ambush warfare. Engagements where tank destroyers fired first from prepared positions resulted in kill ratios exceeding 12-1. Engagements where tank destroyers encountered German armor during mobile operations resulted in kill ratios of approximately 3-1. Meeting engagements where neither side had positional advantage resulted in approximately 1-1 ratios. The data demonstrated that the critical variable wasn't the tank destroyer vehicle itself, but the tactical conditions under which it engaged. The ambush doctrine had solved the fundamental problem that had plagued tank destroyer operations in North Africa. It neutralized German advantages in gun range, optical quality, and crew experience by ensuring that American forces controlled the terms of engagement. German tanks were most vulnerable when moving in column, on roads, and the ambush doctrine positioned American tank destroyers exactly where they could exploit that vulnerability. By winter 1944, German tactical documents were advising panzer commanders to avoid predictable routes, advance with extensive reconnaissance, and immediately withdraw when engaged by unidentified anti-tank fire. These defensive adaptations were direct responses to American tank destroyer ambush tactics. The fact that German forces changed their doctrine to counter American tactics represented strategic success. The hunters had become the hunted. The final year of the war in Europe saw ambush tactics reach their highest level of sophistication. Tank destroyer battalions worked closely with intelligence officers to identify likely German armor routes. Engineers prepared positions in advance, creating hull-down positions with overhead concealment and cleared fields of fire. Artillery units registered defensive fires to suppress German infantry that might otherwise spot tank destroyer positions. Infantry observers with radios provided early warning of German movements, allowing tank destroyer commanders to decide optimal moments to engage. The engagement near Nancy that destroyed 3 Tigers in September 1944 became a case study in tank destroyer schools. Early's positioning, which allowed 1,200-yard flank shots against vehicles moving perpendicular to his line of sight, represented optimal ambush geometry. His coordination with Sergeant Webb's section, which provided overlapping fire to prevent German withdrawal, demonstrated how multiple tank destroyers could create inescapable kill zones. And his fire discipline, which allowed German infantry to pass unmolested while waiting for armor, showed the patience that effective ambush required. After the war, German tank commanders who survived encounters with American tank destroyer ambushes described the psychological impact of this form of warfare. Hauptmann Heinrich Bergmann, who commanded a company of Panthers during the fighting in France, was interviewed by American historical officers in 1946. His description of encountering tank destroyer ambushes is revealing. "We learned to fear the roads," Bergmann said. "In open terrain, we could see the enemy and fight. But on roads, through forests, through villages, we knew American anti-tank guns were waiting. We could not see them, we could not suppress them before they fired. And once they fired, often the first indication was your lead vehicle exploding. Then, you are trapped. You cannot maneuver off the road in heavy terrain. You cannot advance because the lead vehicle is burning and blocking the way. You cannot reverse because you know they have positioned to cover withdrawal, so you sit and wait for the next shot. The psychological reversal was complete. German armor, which had dominated European battlefields through aggressive maneuver and superior firepower, had been reduced to a defensive mindset where simply advancing became an exercise in managed terror. American tank destroyer crews, using vehicles that were technically inferior to German heavy tanks, had achieved psychological dominance through tactics that turned German strengths into vulnerabilities. The ambush doctrine also changed how American forces thought about terrain. In traditional maneuver warfare, good terrain allowed movement and provided cover during advances. In ambush warfare, good terrain offered concealment, long fields of fire, and natural funnels that forced enemy movement into predetermined kill zones. Tank destroyer commanders learned to read terrain the way snipers read it, identifying positions where they could observe without being observed and fire without being located. This shift from maneuver-centric to position-centric thinking represented a fundamental evolution in American armor doctrine. The lessons extended beyond tank destroyers. Infantry anti-tank teams adopted similar ambush principles when employing bazookas and later recoilless rifles. Artillery forward observers learned to create engagement zones where German armor would be forced into pre-registered fire areas. Even armor units began incorporating ambush principles into defensive operations. The M4 Sherman, which struggled in direct engagement against German heavy tanks, became far more effective when used from prepared positions in hull-down defensive locations. The kill ratios achieved by American tank destroyers using ambush tactics had lasting influence on post-war armor doctrine. When the United States Army developed its armored cavalry concept in the 1950s, the core principle was positional reconnaissance, using light armor to identify enemy forces and direct fires rather than engaging directly. When anti-tank guided missiles entered service in the 1960s, employment doctrine emphasized concealed launch positions and immediate displacement after firing, the same shoot and relocate principles that tank destroyer crews had pioneered. Modern American armor doctrine still emphasizes the importance of engaging from positions of advantage rather than seeking fair fights. The phrase, "If you find yourself in a fair fight, your tactics suck," has become informal shorthand for principles that were formalized during World War II tank destroyer operations. The idea that technological inferiority can be offset by tactical superiority, that patient preparation beats aggressive action, that controlling engagement conditions matters more than individual vehicle capabilities. All of these concepts trace back to the doctrinal revolution that transformed American tank destroyers from failed cavalry into successful assassins. Staff Sergeant Robert Earley survived the war. He commanded the same M10 from September 1944 until Germany surrendered in May 1945. His crew destroyed 11 confirmed German armor vehicles, all from ambush positions at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. After the war, he rarely spoke about his combat experiences. In 1979, when a local newspaper interviewed him for a Veterans Day article, he was asked what he remembered most about the war. "The waiting," Earley said. "People think war is constant action. For us, it was hours of sitting in cold rain watching empty roads, then 30 seconds of violence, then more waiting." The reporter asked if the waiting was harder than the combat. Earley thought for a long moment. "The combat was just math," he said. "Range, angle, penetration values. You did the calculations and pulled the trigger. The waiting was harder because you had time to think about what you were about to do. Time to think about the men in those tanks who didn't know we were there. That part never got easier." The moral complexity of ambush warfare, the psychological weight of killing from positions of overwhelming advantage, these were costs that doctrine never adequately addressed. But they were costs that American tank destroyer crews bore because the alternative was higher casualties on both sides and a longer war. The mathematics were clear. Ambush tactics saved American lives. They shortened the war in Europe by destroying German armor faster than it could be replaced. They demonstrated that tactical innovation could overcome technological disadvantage. But Early's discomfort with describing combat as just math reveals the human reality behind the statistics. Every destroyed German tank represented men who died, often without ever seeing their killers. The efficiency that made ambush tactics militarily successful made them morally troubling to the men who executed them. This tension between effectiveness and ethics would echo through every subsequent American conflict, where superior technology and tactical preparation created asymmetric advantages. The tank destroyers that fought in Europe were scrapped within years of the war's end. The M10 and M36 both became obsolete as post-war tanks evolved, but the tactical principles they validated remained current. Every American anti-armor system deployed in the decades since World War II, from tube-launched wire-guided missiles to modern Javelin systems, employs some variant of the ambush doctrine that tank destroyer battalions pioneered. Concealment, positional advantage, engagement at maximum effective range, immediate displacement if position is compromised. The specific weapons change. The fundamental tactics endure. A handful of M10 tank destroyers survive in museums, their 3-inch guns pointed at nothing, their open turrets exposed to weather instead of shell fragments. Walk around one at the American Armored Foundation Tank Museum, and the vehicle seems almost fragile, thin armor and exposed crew positions that look suicidally vulnerable compared to modern armored vehicles. But read the combat record, the 9-to-1 kill ratios, the 3,700 German vehicles destroyed, the tactical revolution that turned a marginally effective vehicle into one of the war's most successful tank killers. And the real story becomes clear. The M10 wasn't successful because it was the best tank destroyer. It was successful because American crews learned to fight from positions where being best didn't matter. They learned that the perfect shot from an unseen position beats the strongest armor. They learned that patience and preparation defeat aggression and superior technology. They learned to kill tigers from hidden positions at 1,200 yards, and in learning that lesson, they changed how modern armies think about armored warfare. The tank destroyer crews who waited in cold rain, who watched enemy columns through telescopic sights, who pulled triggers on men who never knew they were there, they carried a psychological burden that victory statistics never captured. But they also demonstrated that warfare's outcome is determined not by who has the best equipment, but by who uses their equipment most effectively. The German Tiger was mechanically superior to the M10 in every measurable way. Thicker armor, more powerful gun, better optics, more experienced crews. But Tigers died in ambushes at 1,200 yards because their advantages were negated by tactics that forced them into disadvantageous positions. That tactical revolution, born from the failures of North Africa and perfected in the forests of France, represents one of World War II's most significant but least celebrated innovations. American tank destroyer battalions proved that you don't need the best weapon to win. You need the discipline to wait for the perfect shot, the intelligence to position where your weapon's strengths are maximized and the enemy's strengths are neutralized, and the moral fortitude to execute tactics that feel unsporting but save lives and win wars. Those lessons remain relevant anywhere asymmetric warfare occurs, which is to say, they remain relevant everywhere. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.